The police car doors slammed shut like gunshots in the morning air. Two officers walked toward my driveway where my wife Sarah stood in her Navy PT gear, sweat still dripping from her morning run. She had just returned from 8 months aboard the USS Truman, serving our country while I held down our home. Now Margaret Wilson, our HOA president, stood behind the officers with her arms crossed and a smug smile painted across her face. "That is her," Margaret said, pointing at my wife like she was identifying a criminal. "The one who has been terrorizing our peaceful neighborhood." I watched Sarah straighten her shoulders, that familiar military bearing taking over. The lead officer stepped forward, his hand resting on his radio. What happened next would change everything in our quiet suburban street. That is when I realized Margaret had no idea who she was really dealing with. 8 months. That is how long Sarah had been gone, serving aboard the USS Truman somewhere in the Mediterranean. 8 months of empty dinners, cold beds, and trying to maintain our home while working two jobs just to keep up with the bills. When I finally saw her walking through that airport terminal, her Navy uniform crisp despite the long flight, I felt like I could breathe again for the first time in months. Sarah scanned the crowd until her eyes found mine. Even exhausted, she carried herself with that quiet confidence that had first attracted me to her years ago. Her sea bag was slung over her shoulder like it weighed nothing, though I knew it contained months of memories and experiences I could never fully understand. "Welcome home, sailor," I whispered as she fell into my arms. The drive through our neighborhood felt surreal after her absence. Everything looked the same but somehow different. Our subdivision of Maplewood Heights stretched out in neat rows of identical houses, each with its perfectly manicured lawn and regulation mailbox. The homeowners association made sure of that. Every blade of grass had to be the right height, every fence the approved color, every holiday decoration removed by the designated date. As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed Mrs. Chen from next door waving from her garden. The Miller kids rode their bikes in circles, shouting hellos to Sarah. Even grumpy old Mr. Peterson nodded from his porch. This was what I had missed most during her deployment. Not just Sarah, but the feeling of being complete in our little corner of the world. Our house stood modest but proud among its neighbors. 2 stories of cream-colored siding with forest green shutters, a small front porch with hanging plants that I had somehow managed to keep alive. The lawn needed cutting, I noticed with a pang of guilt. The mailbox could use a fresh coat of paint. There were a few other things that had slipped while Sarah was away, and I was juggling work and home maintenance alone. "The grass got a little long," I said apologetically as we gathered her gear from the car. Sarah looked around our property with tired but loving eyes. "It looks like home," she said simply. "That is all that matters." I had received a few notices from the HOA during her deployment. Nothing serious, just the usual nitpicking about minor maintenance issues. I had planned to address them when Sarah returned, and we could tackle the projects together. The association could wait a few more days. My wife had just returned from serving our country. Surely that earned us some understanding. Sarah shouldered her sea bag and looked up at our front door. "All I want is a hot shower, one of your home-cooked meals, and to sleep in our own bed for 12 straight hours." I wrapped my arm around her waist, feeling the solid strength that came from months of military discipline. "Welcome home, Sarah, really home." As we walked up the front steps together, I felt a deep satisfaction. Our family was whole again. Our house was a home again. Whatever small issues needed addressing around the property could wait. Tonight was about celebrating the return of the most important person in my world. I had no idea that our peace would be shattered before the sun rose again. The aggressive pounding on our front door came at exactly 7:30 in the morning. Sarah was still asleep upstairs, finally getting the rest she deserved after months of ship duty and the long journey home. I stumbled to the door in my bathrobe, expecting maybe a delivery or a neighbor with a friendly welcome. Instead, I found Margaret Wilson standing on our porch like a general preparing for battle. Margaret was everything you would picture when you heard the words HOA President. Perfectly styled gray hair that never moved in the wind, a pantsuit that looked like it cost more than my monthly salary, and a clipboard clutched in her manicured hands like a weapon. Her eyes swept across our front yard with the precision of a military inspector, cataloging every perceived violation. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said, though her tone suggested it was anything but good. "I trust your wife has returned from her travels." "Sarah just got back from deployment yesterday," I replied, trying to keep my voice friendly despite the early hour and her obvious attitude. "She is still resting." Margaret consulted her clipboard with dramatic flair. "Well then, this is perfect timing for both of you to address the multiple violations that have accumulated on this property over the past several months." She began reading from her list with the enthusiasm of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Grass height exceeding regulation standards by 2 inches, mailbox paint peeling on the south side, holiday decorations remaining displayed past the January 15th deadline, and improper storage of recreational equipment visible from the street. My heart sank as I realized she was talking about the small basketball hoop Sarah had bought for the neighborhood kids to use in our driveway. It had been one of the few joys during her deployment, watching the children play and laugh in our yard. "Look, Mrs. Wilson," I said, trying to maintain patience. "Sarah has been deployed for 8 months. I have been working 2 jobs just to keep up with everything. I know there are a few things that need attention, but we just need a little time to get caught up." Margaret's expression did not soften even slightly. "Military deployment does not excuse violation of community standards, Mr. Thompson. These rules exist to protect all of our property values. I have been more than patient, but my patience has limits." She gestured towards Sarah's military vehicle parked in our driveway, a modest sedan with Navy base parking stickers. "And I suppose this government vehicle will be a permanent fixture now that she has returned from her government job." The dismissive way she said "government job" made my blood boil. Sarah had not been away on some cushy desk assignment. She had been serving on one of the most advanced aircraft carriers in the world, working 12-hour shifts in challenging conditions, separated from her family to serve her country. "Sarah serves in the United States Navy," I said firmly. "She has been deployed aboard the USS Truman." "Yes, well," Margaret waved her hand dismissively, "government employees are all the same. They think the rules do not apply to them." That is when I heard footsteps behind me. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wearing her bathrobe and looking exhausted but alert. Her hair was still messed from sleep, but she carried herself with that military bearing that never completely left her, even at home. "Good morning," Sarah said politely, extending her hand to Margaret. "I am Sarah Thompson. I do not believe we have met." Margaret looked at Sarah's offered hand like it might contaminate her. "Margaret Wilson, president of the Maplewood Heights Homeowners Association. I was just explaining to your husband the various violations that need immediate attention." Sarah nodded calmly, though I could see the tension building in her shoulders. "I understand there are some maintenance issues we need to address. I just returned yesterday from deployment, but we will certainly work on getting everything up to standard." "Work on it," Margaret's voice rose sharply. "Mrs. Thompson, These violations have been accumulating for months. The community has standards, and those standards will be maintained. You have 48 hours to address these issues, or daily fines will begin accumulating at $50 per violation per day. I watched Sarah's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. In the military, she was used to clear chains of command and reasonable leadership. Margaret Wilson was neither reasonable nor a leader. "We understand," Sarah said quietly, though her voice carried an edge that Margaret completely missed. "We will address your concerns." Margaret smiled triumphantly and turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Mrs. Thompson, welcome to the neighborhood. I do hope you will be a better neighbor than some of our other transient residents." As Margaret clicked away on her high heels, I saw something dangerous flash in Sarah's eyes. My wife had faced down storms at sea and hostile waters in foreign ports. Margaret Wilson had no idea what she had just awakened. Over the next week, Margaret Wilson transformed from neighborhood busybody into a full-scale stalker. Every single day brought new harassment, new complaints, new ways to make our lives miserable. It started with daily visits to photograph our property like she was documenting crime scenes. I would look out the window and see her standing at the edge of our lawn, snapping pictures of our grass with a measuring tape. She photographed our mailbox from multiple angles, our front steps, even the small garden Sarah had planted years ago. Each photo was dated and time-stamped, building what looked like a legal case against us. The certified letters began arriving every other day. Thick envelopes with official-looking seals, each one containing new violations and threats of legal action. Sarah would come home from trying to readjust to civilian life and find another stack of Margaret's harassment waiting in our mailbox. "Look at this," Sarah said one evening, holding up the latest letter. "She is now claiming our doormat is not regulation size." I watched my wife struggle with the transition from military service to suburban pettiness. Sarah had spent months coordinating complex operations aboard a nuclear aircraft carrier. Now she was being nitpicked about the color of our garden hose. Margaret seemed to take special pleasure in criticizing everything Sarah did to address the original violations. When Sarah spent her Saturday morning cutting the grass to the exact regulation height, Margaret appeared within hours to complain that the clippings had not been removed fast enough. When Sarah painted the mailbox, Margaret found fault with the shade of paint, claiming it was not the approved color despite being identical to every other mailbox in the neighborhood. The phone calls started coming at all hours. Margaret would call during dinner to report that our newspaper had been left on the driveway for 20 minutes past the acceptable time. She called early in the morning to complain about Sarah's morning runs, claiming the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk was disturbing her sleep. "These military families think they can just do whatever they want," Margaret said during one particularly nasty phone call that I overheard. "They move around so much, they never really invest in a community." The breaking point came when Sarah's Navy friends came to visit. It was supposed to be a simple welcome-home barbecue in our backyard. Nothing fancy, just burgers and beer with a handful of service members who had become like family to Sarah over the years. These were people who had served alongside her, who understood the sacrifices of military life. Within an hour of the first car arriving, Margaret was at our door complaining about the parking situation. Our guests had parked legally on the street, but Margaret claimed they were creating a traffic hazard and disturbing the peace of the neighborhood. "There are too many cars," she declared, standing in our backyard uninvited. "This is a residential area, not a military base." I watched Sarah's face as Margaret continued her tirade. These friends had traveled hours to welcome Sarah home, and Margaret was treating them like criminals for existing in our neighborhood. "Ma'am," said Chief Petty Officer Martinez, one of Sarah's closest friends, "we are just having a quiet barbecue. We will be respectful of the noise levels." Margaret looked at him like he had personally insulted her. "I do not care what your rank is, young man. This is my neighborhood, and I will not have it overrun by transients." That word, transients, like Sarah and her friends, were homeless drifters instead of people who had dedicated their lives to serving our country. The final straw came 3 days later at the community mailbox. Sarah was walking home from her morning run, still in her PT gear, when Margaret confronted her in front of several neighbors. "I want you to know," Margaret announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "that your behavior has been completely unacceptable since you returned from your little vacation." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face Margaret. For 8 months, she had maintained military discipline under pressure. She had kept her composure through Margaret's harassment, her petty complaints, her dismissive attitude about military service. But calling her deployment a little vacation was the final insult. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice deadly quiet. "You heard me," Margaret replied, apparently mistaking Sarah's calm tone for weakness. "You people think you can come into our neighborhood and ignore our rules. Well, I have news for you. This is not some military base where you can intimidate people. This is a civilized community." I saw something shift in Sarah's posture. The diplomatic sailor was gone, replaced by someone who had earned her rank through strength and determination. "Mrs. Wilson," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed, "I have been nothing but respectful to you and this community. That ends now if you continue this harassment." Margaret's eyes widened at the steel in Sarah's voice, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her attack. "Are you threatening me?" Margaret shrieked, loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood. And that was the moment everything changed. Margaret Wilson had finally found her weapon, and she wielded it with vicious precision. Within 24 hours of the mailbox confrontation, she had filed formal complaints with both the HOA board and the local police department, painting Sarah as an unhinged veteran who was terrorizing the peaceful community. The first letter arrived on official HOA letterhead, signed by all 5 board members. As I read the formal accusations, my hands actually shook with rage. Margaret had twisted every interaction into evidence of Sarah's alleged aggression and threatening behavior. According to Margaret's version of events, Sarah had used military intimidation tactics during their conversation at the mailbox. She claimed Sarah had assumed an aggressive stance and spoken in a threatening manner designed to intimidate a civilian. The letter made it sound like Sarah had cornered a helpless old woman and threatened her with violence. The truth was exactly the opposite. Sarah had simply stood up straight and spoken with the confident voice of someone who refused to be bullied. But Margaret had weaponized that confidence, turning it into evidence of dangerous behavior. "Listen to this," I said, reading from the letter as Sarah sat at our kitchen table with her head in her hands. "The complainant reports feeling unsafe in her own neighborhood due to the subject's unpredictable behavior and apparent inability to control her temper following her return from military service." Sarah looked up with tears in her eyes. "They are making me sound like some kind of unstable veteran who cannot adjust to civilian life." The HOA board had completely bought into Margaret's narrative. The letter demanded that Sarah undergo behavior modification counseling and submit to community service supervision as conditions for remaining in the neighborhood. If she refused, they would begin proceedings to have us removed from our home. I spent hours researching our HOA bylaws, looking for any way to fight back. What I discovered made my blood boil even more. Margaret had been selectively enforcing rules throughout the community for years. Her friends and family received warnings and extensions for the same violations that earned us immediate fines. Some residents had been violating major rules for months without any consequences at all. The evidence was overwhelming. Margaret's own brother had been running an unlicensed business from his garage for 2 years. Her next-door neighbor had installed a fence that was clearly not the approved height or color. The president of the garden club had been displaying non-regulation holiday decorations for an entire season. But none of them had been subjected to daily harassment, photographed like criminals, or threatened with legal action. None of them had been painted as dangerous individuals who threatened community safety. "She is targeting us specifically," I told Sarah as we reviewed the evidence. "This is not about community standards. This is personal." Sarah nodded, but I could see the damage was already done. My wife, who had commanded respect from sailors and officers throughout her career, was beginning to doubt herself. Margaret's campaign of character assassination was working exactly as intended. The situation escalated beyond our worst fears when Margaret decided to involve law enforcement. I was at work when she made the call, but Sarah told me about it that evening with barely controlled fury. "She called the police department and filed a complaint claiming I was stalking her," Sarah said, packing our living room like a caged animal. "She told them I was conducting surveillance on her property and following her around the neighborhood." The accusation was completely insane. Sarah had been going on her regular morning runs, the same route she had used for years before her deployment. If that route happened to pass Margaret's house, it was only because Margaret lived 3 streets over from us in the same neighborhood. "She is claiming that every time I jog past her street, I am engaging in threatening behavior," Sarah continued. "According to her report, I deliberately run past her house to intimidate her." I felt sick imagining how this looked from the outside. Margaret was painting a picture of an unstable military veteran who was stalking and threatening a peaceful community leader. She was playing into every harmful stereotype about veterans struggling to readjust to civilian life. The worst part was that the HOA board and apparently the police were taking her seriously. In their minds, Margaret was a respected community member, reporting legitimate concerns about a potentially dangerous newcomer. 2 days later, Margaret's campaign reached its climax. Sarah had gone for her usual morning run, following the same route she had used for years. She was wearing her Navy PT gear, her hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, sweat glistening on her forehead from the exercise. I was getting ready for work when I heard the car doors slamming outside. Through our front window, I saw 2 police cruisers parked in our driveway. 2 officers were walking toward where Sarah stood stretching after her run, and Margaret Wilson was standing behind them with her arms crossed and a satisfied smile. "That is her," I heard Margaret say, pointing at my wife like she was identifying a criminal. "The one who has been terrorizing our peaceful neighborhood." I watched Sarah straighten her shoulders, that familiar military bearing taking over. She was about to face the consequences of Margaret's lies, but she would face them with the dignity that came from knowing she had done nothing wrong. The lead officer stepped forward, his hand resting on his radio. What happened next would either destroy my wife's reputation forever or reveal the truth about Margaret Wilson's campaign of harassment. I had no idea that Margaret had made the worst miscalculation of her life. The 2 police officers approached Sarah with expressions of professional caution mixed with obvious confusion. They had been dispatched to investigate reports of a dangerous individual, but what they found was a composed woman in military PT gear, calmly stretching after her morning run. "Ma'am," the lead officer said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone trying to assess a situation, "we received a complaint about some alleged threatening behavior. Could we speak with you for a moment?" Sarah straightened to her full height, her military training immediately apparent in her bearing. "Of course, officer. How can I help you?" I watched from our front window as Sarah reached into her pocket and calmly produced her military identification card. The gesture was so natural, so professional, that both officers relaxed slightly. This was not the behavior of someone trying to hide something or avoid accountability. "I am Petty Officer First Class Sarah Thompson, United States Navy," she said, handing over her ID. "I just returned from an 8-month deployment aboard the USS Truman." The lead officer examined her identification carefully, and I saw his entire demeanor shift. His partner, a younger officer, stepped closer to get a better look at the ID. Whatever they saw, there was clearly not what they had been expecting. "Ma'am," the lead officer said, his tone now respectful, "we received a complaint from Ms. Wilson here about alleged stalking and threatening behavior. She claims you have been following her and making her feel unsafe in the neighborhood." Sarah nodded calmly, never breaking eye contact with the officer. "Officer, I have been taking my regular morning runs through this neighborhood for 3 years. I follow the same route every day, which happens to pass through several streets in our community. If Ms. Wilson feels threatened by my presence on public sidewalks, I am sorry for that, but I have done nothing wrong." The lead officer turned to Margaret, who had been standing behind them with increasing impatience. "Ms. Wilson, can you describe the specific threatening behavior you witnessed?" Margaret launched into her prepared speech about feeling unsafe and being intimidated, but as she spoke, I could see the officers exchanging glances. Her story was becoming more dramatic with each telling, and the inconsistencies were becoming apparent. "She deliberately runs past my house every morning," Margaret insisted. "She stares at my property. She is obviously conducting surveillance." "Ma'am," the younger officer interjected, "are you saying she threatens you by jogging on public sidewalks?" "It is the way she does it," Margaret replied, her voice rising. "She has this military bearing, this intimidating presence. She is trying to scare me." That was when the lead officer dropped the bombshell that changed everything. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, "I should mention that I am also Navy. I served aboard the USS Enterprise before joining the police force." His voice carried a note of recognition and respect that Margaret clearly did not understand. Sarah's face lit up with understanding. "What was your rate, if you do not mind me asking?" "Master at Arms, Petty Officer Second Class," he replied. "I did ship security for 6 years before getting out." I watched Margaret's expression change as she realized the two service members were connecting in a way she could not comprehend or control. The officer was not just investigating a complaint anymore. He was talking to a fellow veteran, someone who understood the real meaning of service and sacrifice. "The USS Truman," the officer continued. "That is a CVN, right? Nuclear carrier." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "I was part of the operations department. We were deployed to the Mediterranean for counterterrorism operations." The officer nodded with clear respect. "That is serious duty. What was your role in operations?" As Sarah began explaining her actual responsibilities aboard the carrier, Margaret became increasingly agitated. She had expected the police to simply arrest Sarah based on her complaints. Instead, she was watching her carefully constructed narrative fall apart as the officers realized they were dealing with a highly trained, professional service member rather than some dangerous individual. "This is ridiculous," Margaret interrupted. "I do not care what her job was. She is threatening me and I demand you arrest her." The lead officer turned to Margaret with a look of barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, we are conducting an investigation. Making threats and feeling intimidated by someone jogging in their own neighborhood are two very different things." "She uses military tactics to intimidate civilians," Margaret insisted, her voice becoming shrill. "She is unstable. These military people cannot adjust to normal life." That comment hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The lead officer, who had just identified himself as a veteran, stared at Margaret with a look of complete disbelief. "Ma'am," he said coldly, "I am going to need you to be very specific about what threatening behavior you actually witnessed." Margaret Wilson had just insulted a police officer's military service to his face while trying to have his fellow veteran arrested. She had no idea how badly she had just miscalculated. The atmosphere shifted dramatically as the lead officer focused his attention on Sarah with professional interest rather than suspicion. Margaret's insult about military people being unable to adjust to normal life had clearly struck a nerve with the veteran officer, and now he seemed determined to get to the truth. "Petty Officer Thompson," he said formally, "can you tell me more about your specific duties aboard the Truman? I am familiar with carrier operations, but every deployment is different." Sarah stood at attention, her military bearing now an asset rather than something Margaret could twist into a weapon. "Sir, I was assigned to the operations department as a specialist in tactical communications and logistics coordination. My primary responsibility was coordinating between different departments during flight operations and security protocols." "That sounds like a high-level position," the officer noted, making notes in his pad. "What security clearance level?" "Secret clearance, sir, with additional compartmentalized access for certain operations." Margaret, who had been growing increasingly agitated during this exchange, finally exploded. "This is completely irrelevant. I do not care what her government job was. She is not special. She is just another government employee who thinks she is above the rules." The two officers exchanged a look that spoke volumes. The lead officer turned to Margaret with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, Petty Officer Thompson here holds a position of significant responsibility in our nation's defense. Her security clearance alone indicates a level of trust and reliability that has been thoroughly vetted by our government." "So what?" Margaret snapped. "That does not give her the right to intimidate me in my own neighborhood." The officer turned back to Sarah. "Can you be more specific about your role in logistics coordination? I am curious about the scope of your responsibilities." Sarah glanced at me, then back at the officer. "Sir, part of my duties included coordinating with various law enforcement agencies when we were in port. I worked directly with military police, base security, and sometimes local law enforcement in foreign ports to ensure proper protocols were followed." The younger officer looked up from his notes with obvious interest. "You worked with military police. What kind of coordination?" "Security protocols, sir. When we had shore leave or diplomatic visits, I helped coordinate security measures between ship personnel and various law enforcement agencies. I also assisted with any incidents involving ship personnel that required law enforcement intervention." Margaret was practically vibrating with frustration. "I do not care if she was the admiral of the whole Navy. She has been stalking me and threatening me, and I want her arrested right now." The lead officer studied Margaret for a long moment, then looked back at Sarah. Petty Officer Thompson, in your experience working with law enforcement, how would you characterize the complaints that have been made against you? Sarah considered the question carefully. Sir, based on my experience, I would say that the complaints appear to be exaggerated and possibly fabricated. The alleged behavior she describes does not match the reality of my actions, which have been limited to normal activities like jogging and maintaining my property. Have you ever made any threats against Ms. Wilson? No, sir, absolutely not. Have you ever engaged in any behavior that could reasonably be considered stalking or harassment? No, sir. I have maintained my normal routine, which includes jogging through public areas of our neighborhood. The officer turned to Margaret. Ms. Wilson, can you provide any evidence of these alleged threats, any witnesses, any documentation? Margaret's face reddened. I do not need witnesses. I know what I experienced. She used her military training to intimidate me. How specifically did she use her military training to intimidate you? She stood up straight. She used that military voice. It was threatening. The officers looked at each other again, and I could see they were struggling not to laugh. Margaret had just accused Sarah of threatening behavior for having good posture and speaking clearly. The lead officer consulted his notes. Ms. Wilson, I have to ask, have you filed multiple complaints about Petty Officer Thompson with your homeowners association? Yes, because she keeps violating community standards. And how many complaints have you filed with our department? Margaret hesitated. This is the second time I have called about her behavior. The second time in how many days? Well, that is not the point. The officer turned to Sarah. Petty Officer Thompson, given your experience with law enforcement protocols, would you be interested in filing a harassment complaint against Ms. Wilson? Sarah considered this for a moment, and I could see her military training taking over. She was not reacting emotionally or seeking revenge. She was thinking strategically about the best way to resolve the situation. Sir, Sarah said carefully, I would prefer to find a way to resolve this situation that allows everyone to live peacefully in our neighborhood. However, if the harassment continues, I would certainly consider taking appropriate legal action. Margaret's eyes widened as she realized the tables were turning. You cannot file harassment charges against me. I am the victim here. The lead officer looked at Margaret with something approaching disgust. Ma'am, filing false police reports is a crime. Misusing emergency services for personal vendettas is also a crime. I strongly suggest you think very carefully about your next actions. Margaret Wilson was finally beginning to understand that she had made a terrible mistake. She had tried to use the police to intimidate a decorated military service member, and it was about to backfire spectacularly. The moment of truth had arrived, and I watched from our front window as the lead officer prepared to deliver justice with quiet authority. Margaret Wilson stood on our driveway, no longer the confident HOA president who had been terrorizing our family for weeks. Instead, she looked like someone who had finally realized she had picked a fight with the wrong person. Ms. Wilson, the officer said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority, after reviewing the evidence and speaking with both parties, I need to make something very clear. Filing false police reports is a criminal offense. Misusing emergency services for personal disputes is also a serious matter. Margaret's face had gone from red with anger to pale with fear. I did not file any false reports. Everything I told you was true. Ma'am, you claim that Petty Officer Thompson was stalking you by jogging on public sidewalks. You claimed she was conducting surveillance on your property by following her established running route. You claimed she threatened you by speaking with confidence and maintaining good posture. The officer's tone made it clear how ridiculous these accusations sounded when stated plainly. She did intimidate me, Margaret insisted, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. The younger officer stepped forward. Ms. Wilson, we have now responded to 2 separate calls from you about the same individual. In both cases, we have found no evidence of any criminal behavior. However, we have found evidence of a pattern of harassment directed at a military service member and her family. Sarah maintained her military bearing throughout this exchange, but I could see the quiet satisfaction in her eyes. She was not gloating or seeking revenge. She was simply watching justice take its course. Petty Officer Thompson, the lead officer said, turning to Sarah, you have the right to file formal harassment charges against Ms. Wilson. You also have the right to file a complaint about the misuse of police services. How would you like to proceed? Sarah took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried the wisdom and restraint that had earned her military rank. Officer, I appreciate your professionalism in handling this situation. What I want most is for this harassment to stop so my family and I can live peacefully in our home. But if it continues, I will not hesitate to pursue all available legal remedies. Margaret tried one final desperate power play. You cannot do this to me. I am the president of the Homeowners Association. I have rights. I pay taxes. I demand that you remove this woman from our neighborhood. The officer stared at Margaret with complete disbelief. Ma'am, Petty Officer Thompson has every right to live peacefully in her own home. She has served our country with honor, and she deserves to be treated with respect, not harassed by neighbors who should be thanking her for her service. I want her gone, Margaret screamed, her composure completely shattered. This is a respectable neighborhood. We do not need people like her here. That was the final straw. The lead officer's expression hardened as he realized Margaret's true character. Ma'am, I am going to give you an official warning right now. Any further harassment of this family, any more false police reports, any continued misuse of emergency services, and you will be arrested. Do you understand me? Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but the younger officer cut her off. Ms. Wilson, I strongly recommend you accept this warning and change your behavior immediately. Sarah stepped forward, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she addressed Margaret directly. Mrs. Wilson, I have spent my career serving alongside people from all walks of life. I have learned that the best communities are built on mutual respect, understanding, and support for one another. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about honor and service. I am willing to work with you and the HOA to address any reasonable concerns about our property, but I will not tolerate harassment, intimidation, or attempts to paint me as something I am not. Margaret tried to interrupt, but Sarah continued. I have served this country for years, including 8 months away from my family aboard the USS Truman. I have earned my place in this community, and I will not be driven from my home by someone who confuses power with leadership. The officer nodded approvingly. Ma'am, that sounds very reasonable. Ms. Wilson, do you have any response to this offer of cooperation? Margaret's final response revealed everything about her character. I do not have to cooperate with anyone. I am the HOA president. I will have her removed from this neighborhood one way or another. The lead officer shook his head sadly. Ma'am, you are making threats against a military service member in front of 2 police officers. I strongly suggest you stop talking and go home." As Margaret stormed off toward her car, her heels clicking angrily on the pavement, neighbors began emerging from their houses. They had been watching the entire confrontation, and now they came forward to show their support for Sarah. Mrs. Chen approached first, followed by the Miller family, then Mr. Peterson and several other neighbors. They surrounded Sarah with warm smiles and words of support, thanking her for her service and apologizing for Margaret's behavior. "We never believed those accusations," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "We know what kind of person you are, Sarah." The officers prepared to leave, but the lead officer had one final message. "Petty Officer Thompson, if you have